Hello and welcome to Cosmic Goblins, a fiction podcast specializing in cosmic horror, dark fantasy, and all things weird and disturbing. I'm your host, Alex Wolfgang. This episode's story goes out to anyone who has ever wished they could change their past. Anyone who has regrets, who feels a longing for human connection and friendship, who isn't always sure they belong. In other words, it's a story for everyone. E.C. Dorgan's Paris Green Toboggan was first published in Cosmic Horror Monthly 68 earlier this month. It's a fitting time to release an episode like this. Not only is the story set in the dead of winter, but it's a time when the year doesn't feel like it's fully kicked off yet. We're still looking back on 2025, wondering what we could have done differently, if this year will be better. For this story, we're featuring the talents of returning narrator Jenifer Witcher. Let's get started.
Cosmic Goblins presents Paris Green Toboggan by E.C. Dorgan. Krista. I couldn't see the ledge or beyond the drop. The spruce were too thick and the sky was too dark. There were 4 of us, Randeep, Heather, Fiona, and me. We were nearing 40, but we were at the top of a tobogganing hill in the frigid cold, sledding. We were wrapping things up. We'd only done a few runs, but the cold was too much. All we could think about was the mulled wine and drunken chocolate souffle waiting for us at Heather's house. My hands were numb. But Fiona made a grab for the toboggan. One more run! She moved so quickly I barely saw her push off. I only caught the back of her green coat as she hurtled down the hill. When she flew off the ledge, I saw a green flash. My vision blurred. My ears popped. There was a deafening thud and the hill moved under us. I fell sideways. Heather shrieked. Randeep dropped his phone in the snow. We scrambled down the hill. Heather twisted their ankle and I fell to my knees. Randeep screamed and we rushed, not caring that we were injured, to see what he'd found. It was a tree. A single spruce with that green toboggan bent and wrapped around. The tree was gushing blood. Crimson rivulets streamed, running down the slope and clotting on trees and rocks. We called Fiona's name, but she didn't answer. We searched for hours, but there was no trace for her. When we called for help, the first responders were flummoxed. There was no body. No tracks. We couldn't speak. We went in our separate directions, forgetting the souffle, not saying goodbye to each other. And when we met to toboggan again 1 week later, my friends didn't remember who Fiona was. Tobogganing had been Randeep's idea. He'd reached out 3 weeks earlier proposing dinner, and none of us had hesitated, even though we were practically strangers. We'd been friends in high school, but decades had passed since we'd seen each other. It was early December. We met at a pizza restaurant in the same location where we used to meet as teenagers. We'd aged, but otherwise hadn't changed. Randeep did something with websites. Heather had a catering company. I was a technical writer. As for Fiona, well, Fiona was Fiona. I had no idea what she did. She'd always been inscrutable, though I'd known her longer than the others. We were 9 when we became friends. When we were 12, we took her mom's car and spun out on ice, almost tumbling into the river valley. A year later, we went to the park and Fiona pointed at a teenager at the end of the block and said, "Crack an egg on her head." And I watched while an egg came flying from the opposite direction and hit the teen in the face. I asked Fiona how she did that, and she didn't answer. She wasn't at school the next day, and I thought she was angry. But it turned out she had appendicitis. When I told Randeep and Heather, they said Fiona must have planned the egg. But when I asked her, she rebuffed me. Randeep proposed we stop at his house for warm clothes and a toboggan. I didn't like the idea, but didn't have the courage to say anything. I wasn't used to being out with people, and I didn't want to be the odd one out. The others thought it was a great idea. The park was a short walk from his house. It was only -14, but I could see my breath. And by the time we got to the hill, my fingers and toes were freezing cold. There was a designated tobogganing area, a low hill cleared of trees and illuminated with lights. It brought back memories. This was where I'd froze my hand as a child. Even now, decades later, I had a patch of skin that was smooth and hairless. To my surprise, tobogganing was fun. We had to take turns. We only had one toboggan between us, and to call it that, it was a roll-up plastic carpet from Canadian Tire that had spent decades in Randeep's garage collecting dust and mouse droppings. Afterwards, we went to Heather's. We sat in their kitchen, sipping homemade mulled wine and ginger cookies. Randeep and Heather's partners joined us. It changed the dynamic and reminded me how different my life was. How I had no friends, no significant others. But by the third mulled wine, I was relaxed again. We reminisced about the past, how the same day Randeep hurt his arm, I got frostbite on my hand. We teased him for complaining, but 2 weeks later he'd gone to the doctor and learned it was broken. He brought the x-ray to school to show us our error. I mentioned the egg and Fiona stiffened. Randeep looked down and Heather got more mugs. My face burned. I couldn't believe the topic was still sensitive. Fiona moved and the room narrowed. My forehead throbbed, and I was hit by a feeling of dread so intense I fell off my chair. My chin hit the ground and I barely felt it. Heather helped me up and I looked at them, dazed. I couldn't shake the feeling something terrible was going to happen. That my mention of the egg had awoken some sleeping fate. Randeep started to laugh and Heather joined him. Fiona's eyes widened, then she let out a bellow. I didn't know what was funny, but their laughter dissipated the tension. We went home later than planned, and some late middle-age abandon had come over us. We'd agreed on a second tobogganing session the next weekend. After that night, we were friends again. I went from isolation to having a social life. I couldn't believe my luck. We texted every day and had a group chat. Randeep shared a photo of his x-rayed arm. I was surprised he'd kept it. The picture brought up another memory. As a teen, I'd worked in an antique store. The owners had a successful business selling 60s collectibles, but wanted to branch into real antiques that were worth something. They opened a second store and hired me as the only employee. There were no customers, and I was bored out of my mind. There was nothing to do but read the antique encyclopedia set. The section on x-rays was fascinating. It was written before scientists knew about the dangers of radiation. There were pages of kids, babies, whole families x-raying their appendages. I remembered one picture, a baby's head, the eye sockets, big black holes without end, surrounded by overexposed bone. The store lasted one winter, and I later learned the green binding of the books was made of arsenic-containing Paris green. Even touching the books was dangerous. Fiona. I wanted to kick Krista for mentioning the egg. She was obsessed. And even now, she didn't know I'd paid some kid to throw it. Not that it worked. I'd spent hours punching my gut that night, hoping my appendix would suffice. I got appendicitis. My inflamed organ burst and bled all over the surgical site, and still my sacrifice wasn't enough. It wasn't until we went tobogganing and Krista mentioned the egg that I remembered my plan from all those years ago. I thought about it in the days leading up to our second tobogganing session. Changing the past had a cost. It demanded more than an egg or an appendix. Otherwise, it was simple. Sheila had told me what to do. She taught me the words to say, too. After Krista's reminder, it was all I could think about. I wanted to do it. To be with Sheila on that date 30 years before. For our heads to be touching and to be holding hands until the world crashed down. But the sacrifice. Krista. I bought new mitts and thermal socks ahead of our second tobogganing session. I was so excited I blabbed like a fool to the salesperson, telling the story of my frostbite, showing off my smooth patch of skin. I felt silly but didn't care. I had a friend group. Heather started texting early Saturday. They sent photos of the shortbread cookies they'd baked, shaped like sleds and colored green with homemade icing. It was -17 when we met at the park, but I was prepared with my new mitts and gloves, and I wasn't nervous like the first time. We did a couple runs and had fun. It was Fiona who suggested we climb higher. Tobogganing wasn't allowed at the top of the hill, but we'd gone there as kids anyway. The slope was much steeper and treed. There were no lights. We couldn't see if there were rocks. There was a ledge and a sharp drop. It would be nothing to hit a tree or slide all the way down the hill to the frozen North Saskatchewan River. I mustered the courage to speak. "Is that safe?" No one answered. We trudged up the hill. When we got to the top, I was winded. I didn't dare look down. I touched my mitt to my cheek. Even the temperature was colder. Fiona rubbed her hands. I saw my opening and turned to her. "Aren't your feet cold?" She grinned. "Damn cold!" But it was Randeep who grabbed the toboggan. "I broke my arm once, but what the hell?" We watched, goggle-eyed, while he took off. He flew down the hill and disappeared into the trees. Minutes passed and we waited, not daring to breathe while our hearts thundered. Heather craned their neck. "Randeep!" No answer. Then we were all yelling after him. Heather and I started down the hill. Only Fiona stood there, not moving. "Gotcha!" We turned around, relieved, then angry. Randeep had made his way to the designated tobogganing area and walked back up the hill behind us. My voice croaked. "Maybe we should go." But it was too late. Heather was already on the toboggan. For a moment, it looked like they would hit a tree, but they rolled off the sled seconds before the impact. They tumbled down the hill, then reemerged, flashing a victory sign. Fiona took the sled and smiled wide. She started toward the ledge, then turned to me. I realized her coat was Paris green. She held out the sled. It was the same color. "Why don't you go?" I stepped back. Everyone was looking at me. Randeep held up his phone, and I heard him hit the record button. I didn't want to toboggan, but what would they think if I backed out now? I took the sled, and my stomach dropped. I pushed my fear down. I told myself I'd done this as a child and survived. I knelt down and reminded myself this wouldn't take long. I started to push off, then panicked. I tried to stop, but it was too late. I was plummeting down. And what a rush. The ice on the spruce trees winked at me and parted ways for my toboggan. I went off the ledge and time slowed. The edges of the trees became soft. The spruce needles turned white and the snow was black. I was tobogganing through an X-ray in winter. I blinked and I was going too fast to see anything. I couldn't make out the trees. I couldn't catch my breath. Then I was down the hill, more alive than I'd ever been. When I handed Fiona the toboggan, she didn't hesitate. She got on the sled in a flash, and I barely caught the back of her coat as the trees closed in. She was going fast. Her sled lifted into the air and for a moment stopped. The world narrowed, and when I blinked, I saw the green on her back superimposed on the snow. My feet swayed and Heather caught me. "Are you all right?" I shook my head and Fiona reemerged from the hill. "Let's do that again." Randeep shared the videos the next day. I watched them twice, but there were no strange colors and time didn't slow or stop. When he suggested we toboggan a third time the next weekend, Heather answered with an instant, "Hell yes," and Fiona gave a thumbs up. I didn't know how to reply. I wanted to see my friends, but that hill worried me. I was still hesitating when Heather said they'd made drunken chocolate souffle. Even I couldn't resist liking that. The texts continued, coalescing with concrete plans. I tried not to fret. We were late middle-aged adults. We didn't do reckless things. I'd done it once and been careful. But my nerves. I drove to the park the day before. It was after work, already dark. I slowed the car, trying to measure the ledge and that drop. The road was covered in black ice, and I was so distracted I spun out and almost went over the edge. When I could breathe again, I had to laugh. It reminded me of that drive with Fiona when we were kids. It gave me perspective. I'd gone decades without a social life, and now I had friends. I couldn't go back to how my life had been. Lost years. That's what I called them. After high school, I'd moved east for university. I didn't know anyone and had no friends. It would have been hard for anyone, but I was shy and awkward. When I went to social events, I couldn't make small talk and had nothing in common with people. One day I discovered if I drank wine before going out, I could relax. After university, a municipality in Eastern Ontario hired me as a technical writer. I didn't belong. I missed the prairie sky and the North Saskatchewan River. I missed the long winter nights and even the sharp cold. I started going to the liquor store to buy wine I couldn't afford. The cashiers would frown at me. There was only one store in the town, and everyone knew I lived alone. I drank a quarter of a bottle every day, and then half a bottle, then 3/4. I wanted more, but I couldn't afford it. I started job hunting and was hired by a textbook company in Ottawa. My salary went up. There were more liquor stores, and nobody knew or cared who I was. I blinked, and 10 years had passed. Even now, 5 years on, I didn't know what shook me awake. I moved back to Edmonton and kicked the wine, but I was still lonely. Our third tobogganing session was on the winter solstice. It had snowed the day before, softening the temperature. When we met at the top of the hill, it was a balmy -12. But it was dark. I couldn't see the trees or the ledge. Fiona was the first to toboggan. She took the sled and set off down the hill without a moment of hesitation. Randy went next, then Heather. When Heather was done, they handed me the sled. I was scared. I took my time positioning it. Fiona tapped her foot, impatient. Her face was hooded. It looked like a skull. But when she turned to me, her eyes were soft. I blinked. I'd only seen her like that once before. We were in our 20s. I was visiting for the holidays. It was the shortest day of the year, and -30. Fiona and I were at the Strat, our old haunt on White Ave. People sat with layers of clothes draped over their chairs. Every time someone came or left, we were blasted by Arctic air. Fiona lit a cigarette. I poured more beer. She raised an eyebrow. "Are you going to drink the whole pitcher?" I looked down, realizing I'd already drank 2 pints. My cheeks burned. When I looked up, her eyes were soft. And just like that, the flood burst. I told her everything. How I hated my life. How lonely I was. I'd never opened up like that. When I finished speaking, she didn't comfort me. She only sat there, smoking. She took a long drag. When she started to speak, it wasn't what I expected. "You can change the past, but not for free." The ash on her cigarette lengthened. My appendix burst in the surgeon's hand. Sometimes I imagine it, gushing blood and making rivers down to the floor. I thought she would say more, but she didn't. We drank another pitcher, and she had to help me out of the bar. Later that night, she told me she'd change her past. I slurred the question. Did she really want that? Yes. I'd lose this, but who cares? I pushed the memory away and tried to ignore the vertigo. I couldn't even see where I was tobogganing. This was beyond dangerous, but if I didn't go down the hill, my friends might stop inviting me. They might take me off the group chat. I pushed off and was at the bottom of the hill in a flash. I hadn't crashed into a tree. Time hadn't stopped. When I climbed back up, my friends cheered. I felt like I belonged with them. We did another 2 runs. We were getting ready to leave when Fiona wanted to go one last time. Fiona. Krista was staring at me. I almost felt bad for her. She was so scared of the world. All those years ago, I thought telling her how to change the past would comfort her. The others were gathering their things. I was sorry I'd miss Heather's drunken souffle. But I could feel Sheila in the trees below, waiting. Tobogganing earlier, I'd even caught brief flickers. It was strange how the others couldn't see the green glow. I thought about it. On our second tobogganing session, I'd suggested we climb up here. Krista saw the danger in those trees, but I saw possibility. At the time, I was still ruminating the cost and the opportunity. But now I'd made my decision. I reached into my pocket and touched the place where my appendix once was. I didn't need an appendix. I didn't need an egg. I had a better sacrifice. This time, I really would change the past. I'd be with Sheila. Finally. I told the others, 1 more run. Krista. I was in my 30s when I learned about Sheila. I'd known Fiona since I was 9, and she'd never mentioned her identical twin. I'd never met her either. I assumed when her parents divorced, they were separated. Fiona said she and her twin were close. But Heather later told me the truth. Fiona's sister died when she was 8. She'd been getting an X-ray of her head after hitting a tree on a tobogganing run. The machine fell from the ceiling and crushed the little girl's skull. Fiona. I climbed to the highest point of the hill. The snow had a cold glow and the hoarfrost on the spruce trees twinkled. I could almost see the frozen river reflecting the moon below. I knelt down on the toboggan. Sheila was close. Though she'd never been far. Not really. Death couldn't break the special bond between us. I didn't hesitate. I pushed off. The cold air burned my cheeks as I hurtled down. I'd never gone so fast. When I flew off the ledge, the moon turned black. The night took my breath. I could see the whole city, shining green below my sled. I saw the spruce tree in front of me. It must have been the biggest tree in the city. Sheila stepped out from behind it, extending her arms wide. I used my last breath to say the word she taught me. The world exploded and the moon crashed down. The tree wrapped its branches around me and my twin hugged me so tight my lungs were crushed. 30 years I'd waited, and now I was rewriting my past. I wouldn't be alone. Neither would Sheila. The X-ray flashed and we were lying on our backs, our heads touching, while the machine plummeted. We grabbed each other's hands and the world turned red. Krista. After the accident, I thought about our conversation at the Strat. It almost made sense in retrospect. I dialed Heather to tell them, but hung up before they answered. Heather wouldn't remember Fiona. I wondered why I hadn't forgotten. Was it because of that night at the bar? Fiona had said once she changed her past, she wouldn't be able to go back. Maybe that was why it was like she'd never been our friend. Like she'd died in childhood with her sister. All those years ago, she'd told me how to do it. She'd even taught me the words I had to say. Somehow, despite the passage of time and all the beers I'd drunk that night, I remembered them. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the blood on that tree, the red rivulet streaming down to the river. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Fiona must have really trusted her sister. I trusted her too in the end. I wasn't planning to go through with it. I didn't believe a sting of words and so-called sacrifice could change my life. But still, I imagined it. How I'd make it so I hadn't moved to Ontario, that I hadn't drank away decades. I had time to think. Our group texts were becoming less frequent. We hadn't made plans to Toboggan again. Or maybe my friends were going without me. When I walked into the antique store, the owner looked up. I started toward her, but her eyes passed me over. My cheeks burned. Of course she wouldn't know my face. I wasn't the youthful teenager I'd been when she hired me. I stopped at a mirror. My reflection gave me away. Not just that I'd aged, but that I lived alone, that I'd spent decades drinking, that my life was empty apart from my friend group. I ran out the door wiping tears. I returned to the store the next day. I wandered through the aisles and stopped in my tracks when I saw what was in the corner. Gathering dust and still unsold. The books weren't cheap. $400 for the set. I put them on my credit card and tried not to think about the expense. It took me 6 trips to get the encyclopedia to the car. The green books took up the back seat and most of the trunk. I had a plan. Nothing so extreme as Fiona's. The changes I'd make would be minor. I wouldn't look so haggard. I'd be able to toboggan and come home to someone. When we invited significant others, I wouldn't be alone. Fiona said the sacrifice had to be real. When I got home, I put my frostbitten hand on the green fabric. It wasn't as big as Fiona's sacrifice, but the change I was making was smaller. I was giving up my past. Those days in the antique shop, the patch of smooth skin. What was the essence of me, if not that? I reflected and added a wine bottle. I picked up my phone in case I'd missed a text, but there was nothing. It had been days since our last group chat. I felt a pang in my stomach. What did I have to lose? I poured the wine onto my hand and the book. I could almost feel the arsenic seeping into my pores. I looked at the Paris green book and at my hand. My left hand started to move. I stared, horrified and rapt, while it reached for the knife drawer. Then I gasped while it clenched the blade and pressed it into my once frozen hand, slicing into that smooth, hairless patch. The knife worked, and red rose up my gullet. When I looked down, the green book was covered in blood. My hand hurt. I tried to stop, but instead pushed the blade deeper. I breathed, "No!" But my hand didn't slow. I told myself I didn't want this. But it was a lie. I wanted this more than anything. My lips stirred and pronounced the words Fiona had taught me. My hand and arm went numb. The book was crimson, and so were my pants. My ears popped and room blurred. My phone buzzed with a message from my friends. I dropped the knife and reached for the phone. I tried to take the words back. What I was doing was crazy. I had friends. I could propose a social outing too. But I was too slow. Before I could open the message, the ground moved and my past was gone. 1 month has passed. My skin is perky and I've lived my whole life in Edmonton. My significant other is nice, but has a name I can't remember. Snippets of memory are coming back to me. Like Fiona. Like my friend group. Every night I drive to the park. I look out through the trees and my hot breath freezes in the air. I close my eyes and see a bloody tree and a Paris green coat, hurtling down into the dark. I tell my partner I'm seeing things. My partner runs me a bubble bath, and when I get into the water, I don't feel anything. I lean back in the tub and hear children's feet in the hallway. I get out of the bath and wrap a towel around me. I glimpse my reflection and frown. Something's wrong. My face is too bright. I move closer to the glass and realize that's not skin I'm looking at, but bone. My eyes are empty black sockets. I squint into the mirror, trying to recognize this face. I want to believe this skull is the past I've erased, but I have a feeling it's all that's left of me. My balance wavers. I try to steady, but the bathroom tile is slippery. My feet slide, and the next thing I know, I'm airborne. The bathroom narrows, and the walls change from millennium gray to a green that reminds me of something. My chin hits the ground, and I pull myself back up to standing. There's a knock on the door, and 3 kids come inside, followed by my partner. I blink at them, dazed. Are those kids mine? I can feel the Paris green coursing through my veins, though it wasn't the arsenic that poisoned me. It was that hill and the idea I could change who I was, who I'd been. I had friends. I could have tried. I regret everything. I try to breathe, but the pressure's building in my skull. Bile rushes up my throat and gamma rays blast out of my sinuses. The bathroom walls flash green, then black. My significant other and 3 children look at me blankly. They're strangers to me. I want to say something, to tell them who I really am, to ask if they see this X-ray, this skeleton. But the grief and the dread are choking me. They turn to leave, and I manage a jagged gasp. There's only one thing left to do. I choose my words carefully. Do we have a toboggan?
E.C. Dorgan writes weird fiction and horror stories on Treaty 6 territory near Edmonton, Canada. Her short fiction appears in publications such as The Dark, Augur, Kaleidotrope, and Afterlives, the year's best death fiction. In 2025, she received the Alberta Literary Award for Short Story. Thanks so much for listening to Cosmic Goblins. Once again, today's story was narrated by the talented Jenifer Witcher. I'm your host, Alex Wolfgang. Our theme music was composed by Tyler McLemore. This podcast is a production of Randolph Literary Press. Hope you'll join us next time for episode 15.